coming on the air tonight with the ridiculously wild ride on Wall Street today and what it means for your money. With the Dow up about 99 points at the close, that's typically not a big deal, right? At all. We probably wouldn't even be talking about it, except for what happened before the market closed, when the Dow tanked 1,000 points. Wall Street having a real moment. We're live with the breakdown on why and what's next. And right before we came on the air, we heard about the green light down in Georgia for a special grand jury to officially investigate former President Trump. It's happening. What it means for him, his lies about the 2020 election, and the timeline for it all. Plus, breaking tonight, up to 8,500 troops told to get on alert, to maybe go back up NATO, depending on what Russia does on the border with Ukraine. So why the change in posture for the Biden administration and why now? We're live at the White House and overseas. And one of the biggest battles over masks yet. This one happening just across the river in Virginia, where 7 school boards are suing the governor in a fight that's part pandemic, part political. Plus, a different new lawsuit, this one against Google, over whether it really stops tracking your location when you want it to. We're going to hit on those privacy protections and the accusations they're not all that protective later on in the show. Hey, I'm Hallie, and you don't have to work for our friends at CNBC to be feeling kind of dizzy after the day the markets had. Nose diving first, partly because of those Russia-Ukraine tensions to the tune of 1,000 points in the territory of pop a Pepsid before you check your 401k. But then within just a couple hours, a huge turnaround. The Dow actually closed up almost 100 points. The S&P was also in the green, closing up 12, and the NASDAQ up 86 points. Not too long ago today, while the roller coaster was still roller coastering, I talked with President Biden's top economic advisor about what it all means. What is the White House message to people who may be logging on and look into their retirement accounts and not loving what they see?
Well, look, I think it's what we would say is it's important not to focus on any one day or even 2 days, but to look at trends and progress over time. Fundamentally, you know, we focus on the real economy, not just the financial sector, and our recovery has been strong.
Christina Partsinevelos joins us now to break some of this down. And Christina, listen, today was a rocking comeback by the market, right? One of the best comebacks in a long time. If you are worried, you know, if you have money and you would like to keep your money, right, which I think everybody does, what's the big takeaway for you here?
Well, I'd like to say that we haven't seen a comeback like this since November 2008. So definitely a roller coaster. We even killed commercials throughout CNBC over here. But the big takeaway is that there are 3 major reasons why you're seeing markets, teeter between correction territory that we saw earlier today and then ending in the green. You talked about the NASDAQ, the S&P 500, and the Dow. But what's worrying investors is, firstly, tighter monetary policy from our central bank. The market is expecting 4 interest rate hikes, which pretty much means debt's going to be more expensive for you and I and corporations. And so this first meeting with the Federal Reserve is actually starting tomorrow. So we're going to be looking out for any words from there. And then secondly, you've got these lofty stock valuations. A lot of companies are pretty expensive to buy right now. So some guests that we've had on CNBC have said this could be the time for a healthy reset, even if it did mean 1,000-point swing in the Dow today. And then lastly, inflation. Rising costs for companies and consumers. I'm sure many of our viewers watching right now have noticed the price of food, from meat and diapers going up, gas climbing higher. And so companies are blaming higher costs, you know, like the problems with Omicron, shipping delays, and they're passing those costs on to consumers. So overall, those are the 3 major things. Tech stocks, though, I'd like to also point out, did get hit. We have a lot of earnings coming out this week. So Apple was down, Tesla, and Microsoft was up slightly.
It's so funny to hear you call it a healthy reset, Christina, because that's what I do with my diet in January, right? That's not what you would want the markets to be doing. I spoke with Cecilia Rouse a couple of minutes ago. You know, she pointed to 2 things, pandemic uncertainty, and then she also talked about some of this uncertainty on the international scale for a story we're going to talk about in a second as it relates to Russia and Ukraine. I'm a journalist. I'm not supposed to weigh in, but I do think that maybe using Russia, Ukraine as a reason why markets sold off is not accurate. It is an international problem, a geopolitical tension that the United States will have to weigh in on. But when we're talking about our current issues with the markets, it often revolves around inflation. It often revolves around what federal policy is doing. So we have a lot of people that have come on here and say that maybe that's a stretch. It did add to the negative headlines, and then it adds like a 4th reason as to why we're so upset today and why we saw this volatility. And
you need, Pepsid AC or whatever you said at the top of the show. But I don't necessarily think that had a lot to do with it.
It's good context. It's good clarity. Listen, when CNBC is blowing breaks, it's a big day on Wall Street. So we're glad to have you. We're glad to be having you talk through this all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We got some more breaking news in just the last couple of minutes with a panel of judges in Georgia formally, officially giving the green light to a special grand jury to look into former President Trump's push to overturn the legitimate results of the 2020 election there. It means this grand jury can be seated in early May. They're going to investigate this potential election interference by Mr. Trump and his allies. Remember, just last week, right here on the show, we told you how the Fulton County DA was making that request, which has now been granted. Blaine Alexander was there for us last week. She is back here with us today for this development. And this is a big deal, right? Because she can, the district attorney there can ask for this grand jury. But in this instance, she's actually getting it. And this panel of judges is saying absolutely.
You're saying absolutely, Hallie, and it has been granted.
Are you all set up with your IP?
Oh,
yes, please.
Blaine, I'm going to pause you for Blaine. I'm so sorry, hon. I think we're having a tech issue with, looks like my line producer. I think I can hear her in our ears. We're going to ask everybody to hang tight because I couldn't hear a word you said, Blaine, and I want to hear all the words that you have to say because this is a big deal, right? I mean, this is an investigation into a former president, and now there is a grand jury that's going to be seated in just a few months on this.
On May 2nd, Hallie, that's when they're going to be seated, and it's going to last for no longer than a year. So let's kind of take a step back and look at how we got here. This, of course, deals with that phone call, the phone call that we talked about at length back then, just before we saw the Senate runoffs here in Georgia, where then President Trump asked the Secretary of State, the sitting Secretary of State, to find 11,000 or so votes, enough to overturn the election results here in Georgia. That is what the Fulton County District Attorney is going to really hone in on. So we know that she put that request in last week, and in a letter, she essentially said that she indicated that some witnesses or potential witnesses would not be cooperative, she said, unless they were compelled by law to cooperate. Now, she was specifically talking about the Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger. He responded not too long after that, and he, said that she was doing nothing more than trying to score political points. But this is the most important part. He said, of course, if they are compelled to come before a grand jury, he would obviously do so, follow the law, and do so. So I want to talk about the special grand jury. That's what's interesting here, too. It's a little bit different in that they can only review this matter. It consists of between 16 to 23 people, and they can recommend charges, Hallie, but they cannot return indictments. So certainly a lot to be watching when they actually get started on May 2nd.
Talk about the timeline here, right? Because the ultimate potential legal consequence for former President Donald Trump here is he could potentially face charges, right? Depending on what she finds, depending on how this grand jury goes. But they're going to be seated for a year. So we're looking, maybe past the midterms until we hear more from them, possibly. Do I have that right?
Yes, it could possibly be that long. They can go no longer than a year. So we don't know at what point in this year period they could possibly return something. But yeah, I think it is important to kind of talk about, again, the political undertones and lay those two timelines down. We're talking about primaries coming up, and of course, you're going to see the midterms in November. So all of this is going to be playing out while this grand jury is investigating this matter, looking further into this matter. Remember, this is the phone call from back in January, the very first days of January in 2021. The Fulton County DA has said since then she's going to go after it, continue to go after it. So she's let it known that here in the area of Atlanta, the heavily Democratic area, she's not going to let that go. So it's something that we're going to be, of course, watching very closely and see what implications it possibly has when it comes to the midterms, which, of course, are playing out here as well.
You're in the center of it all there in Georgia. Blaine Alexander, thank you so much for being with us tonight on that developing news. Appreciate it. The current president, President Biden, not too long ago, wrapping up a video call, a conference call with European leaders after the Pentagon today said they're going to put 8,500 U.S. military personnel on this term. They're saying heightened readiness to deploy. It basically means they're putting these troops on alert that they're maybe going to have to go, right? Go to back up NATO troops overseas. But here's the thing. No decision has been made yet. With everybody looking to President Biden here, because ultimately, right, it is in the hands of the commander-in-chief. Depending on what Vladimir Putin and Russia decide to do on the Ukrainian border, it's possible the president could send not just troops, but ships, aircraft to Eastern Europe with those NATO allies in advance of whatever we see from Russia. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki today clarifying the U.S. position.
We have been consulting with allies in deployments and refining plans for all scenarios. We've always said we would reinforce our allies on the eastern flank. we've never ruled out the option of providing additional assistance in advance of an invasion.
Comes as NATO is also putting forces on standby. And the State Department, we heard just in the last 24 hours or so, they're telling people who are family members of U.S. personnel in Kiev and Ukraine to get out. They're saying go, and they're giving non-emergency diplomatic employees the green light to go, too. I want to bring in Mike Memoli at the White House and Matt Bradley in Kiev, who are both covering the story for us. Mike, let me start with you here. There's a couple of pieces of this. First, let me start with the news as we're coming on the air, which is President Biden spoke for about an hour and 20 minutes, right, with our allies in this, situation room call that happened not too long ago. Talk us through what we do and don't know from that.
Well, Hallie, we don't know yet. We haven't gotten a readout from the White House about what specifically came out of this call, but we know why they needed to have it. And we can point back to the president's comments at the news conference to know just what that looks like. You heard Jen Psaki in the clip there saying that they're refining all scenarios. That's a very polite way of saying they're trying to get on the same page, because what we're dealing with is a situation where, yes, the easiest thing for the U.S., for our allies to respond to would be sort of a traditional tanks rolling in from Russia to Ukraine scenario. That's a very clear break of the red line that we have set. What's harder to respond to is things that are short of that, things that are just destabilizing actions, the kinds of things that U.S. intelligence was warning about in terms of a puppet government trying to be installed in Ukraine. So what the president is trying to do is make sure that all of our allies are on the same page about, if it's a minor incursion, to use the president's term, maybe we respond with this. If it's a stronger response from Russia, then we have to respond this way. So that's really where we are, because Russia's not stepping back. They seem to only be escalating further every day.
I think it's important to talk about this idea that these 8,500, up to 8,500 troops are getting put on alert here, Mike, because, this is a change in posture from what we had been hearing from the administration prior to this. And it seems to be, very directly aimed at basically one person who's sitting in the Kremlin right now, and that's Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, if you look back to what Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, was telling reporters a month and a half ago when President Biden had that call with Vladimir Putin, he talked about exactly what the Pentagon is outlining today as sort of a contingency down the road. Well, we're clearly down the road. And really what I'm being told by the administration that has really concerned them is the fact that as you show that map of where some Russian forces are being deployed, you're showing Belarus as part of the equation. That, as the White House has been calling for de-escalation, was a significant escalation on the part of Russia that really has not just Ukraine nervous, but it has other allies in the region nervous. And remember, Ukraine is not a member of NATO. That's what Vladimir Putin wants to try to prevent here. But there are other countries bordering Belarus, bordering Ukraine, that are NATO members, and that is why we're putting these troops on red alert. Because if this were to continue even further, as we see Russia moving into some of these buffer states like Belarus, that's what has our NATO allies concerned, and that requires us, through Article 5, to respond. It
is not hyperbole or exaggeration to say this is brink of war level stuff, and I want to bring in Matt Bradley here. By the way, if it is hyperbole, check me, but I think that seems to be the posture that the United States is treating this, that we're seeing our NATO allies treating this. This is, this is serious stuff. And Matt, if this was a message aimed at Putin, was this message received? I mean, is this very clear to Vladimir Putin how seriously the U.S. takes this right now?
I don't necessarily think that there was never a missed message here, Hallie. I don't think that Vladimir Putin ever missed this. Vladimir Putin, I really think he delights in seeing all of the, pearl clutching and consternation in the West. He loves seeing Western governments confused about his intentions. So I think that this was something that he kind of wanted. This was, he instrumentalized this. This was, seeing people scramble, seeing these powerful nations that have much larger economies, much larger militaries, much more global power than Russia does. That's the goal, if nothing else, to just add discomfort to the Western nations who he despises.
What are you hearing on the ground in Ukraine, Matt?
I'm sorry?
What you're hearing on the ground in Ukraine, right? We know that families of diplomats have been ordered out. There's been a travel warning over the weekend. There's been a lot of moving pieces as it relates to like Ukrainians who are actually there. You are there. Tell me what it's like.
Yeah, I mean, when you walk around here in the Ukrainian capital, it feels normal, I got to tell you. And that's actually one of the startling things here, is that it's really not that tense. People aren't, packing their cars and driving out west. Shops aren't closing. Everybody seems pretty normal, pretty even keel. That's the official message from the government, is to stay calm. And people seem to be obliging by that. You know, I got to tell you, a lot of people here, or at least the people that I've talked to here in the Ukrainian capital, you can call it Kyiv, you can call it Kiev, they have said that a lot of them, they don't necessarily believe that Vladimir Putin is going to go through with it. They kind of actually, even if they don't want Russia to invade, they do buy the line that Vladimir Putin is selling, that a lot of this is just Western media hype, that there is no imminent war, that Vladimir Putin and the West are just riling each other up, and that nothing is necessarily going to happen. They could be right. We don't know. But right now, this is not a tense capital. The drumbeat of war is a distant rumble.
Super interesting. Mike Memoli, Matt Bradley, thank you so much for staying on top of that. I appreciate both your reporting for us from Washington and from Kiev. Gentlemen, thanks. We want to get a little closer to home here with that battle over masks happening in Virginia, with at least 7 Virginia school boards suing over the new governor, Glenn Youngkin's new order that bans mask mandates. The new rule went into effect today after he signed an executive order right as soon as he took office back a couple weeks ago in January to let parents and guardians choose whether their children wear masks in schools. Today, a Youngkin spokesperson released a statement saying, in part, we are disappointed that these school boards, the ones that are suing, are, in their words, ignoring parents' rights. I want to bring in Katie Beck in Richmond, Virginia for us tonight. Katie, you heard the governor's response. The school boards are also talking about this today. These 7 districts suing represent about 350,000 kids. And they're basically saying, listen, if we want to put mask mandates in place in our district, we should be allowed and able to.
Yeah, they're even taking it a step further, Hallie. They're saying this is unconstitutional and goes against protecting children's health and safety. They're saying as we see these pediatric Omicron numbers continue to rise, this is not the optimal time to be taking the mask off. Now, that's what the opposition is saying. There are certainly a lot of parents here in Virginia who don't fall on that side and who think Youngkin's new direction is a good one, saying It's time to take off these masks. It's been too long. You know, this pandemic is stretching on and on and on. How much longer do my kids have to wear this mask at school? And they celebrate the fact that they have a choice. He made that promise to parents as he was on the campaign trail, and on day one of him being elected, you know, he put it into effect. So now we're seeing that come to bear. This is the day it's supposed to take effect, and he's now being sued by 7 school districts. So this is going to be an ongoing fight, and bringing out the most passionate of parents to the forefront. It's going to have to be decided ultimately, probably in a court.
It seems like it, right? Because I think about putting this in the context of what we've talked about a lot as it relates to not just where you are, Katie, in Virginia, but to places all over the country with these school boards dealing with really intense, heated, as you say, passionate topics. Just last week, a parent threatened to bring guns to school over a mask mandate. Like, this is getting people incredibly fired up, incredibly upset. Teachers are frustrated, too, right? I know you've been talking with some of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Teachers, parents, and the parents and teachers who want to keep the mask mandate in place say it's a matter of security for them and for their kids. They've both gotten used to wearing these. They don't feel comfortable going into classrooms without this layer of protection, especially as they see cases at high numbers as they are right now. They realize that there are some places where they're going to go down, but they haven't quite done that yet here. So they're saying, you know, this is dangerous. Like, we absolutely don't feel safe going into a classroom like this. Youngkin's point is, you know, you can wear a mask if you want to, but you shouldn't be mandated to. Parents should be able to have this choice. And they say they're going to defend that position. They're going to defend it in court, and they plan to have a rigorous fight over it.
So let's say this court fight does go down, as I think everybody anticipates it will. What's the timeline, Katie? How long would something like that take in the context of, you know, a school year, let's say, which would end in, what, June?
Yeah, the thing about this is it could take weeks or months to resolve, to get to, say, the Virginia Supreme Court and be decided and have an ultimate decision that is the law of the land. By that time, you know, you don't know if school's still in session. Right. You don't know what the numbers are going to be for Omicron because they're ever changing. And as we've seen, there are, you know, spikes and then things start to go down. So, you know, will it be relevant? Will it be a factor by the time it's decided? It's hard to tell, but it is certainly going to be a fight for some time.
Katie Beck, live for us there in Richmond, Virginia, on this story, making headlines nationally. Katie, thank you. Prosecutors in the federal trial of 3 former Minneapolis police officers say those men stood by as their fellow officer, Derek Chauvin, quote, slowly killed George Floyd right in front of them. A defense attorney, for one of the officers, firing back, saying Derek Chauvin was the one calling all the shots, in their words, that day. Those are the big headlines from opening statements in the federal trial for these three people, Jake King, Thomas Lane, and Tu Tao. Those opening statements wrapping up not too long before we actually got up in the studio here. The jury's getting ready to hear from the first witnesses. These three former officers are all charged with violating Floyd's civil rights, meaning they did not intervene when Floyd needed help. They didn't go in and help him, and they needed to. That's the charge. They're all pleading not guilty. A jury of 12 people was selected last week, 7 women, 5 men, overwhelmingly white jury, according to pool reporters. Also in the room today, Floyd's brother, nephew, and girlfriend. Megan Fitzgerald is in St. Paul reporting on this. And Megan, you know, you've got the defense attorney for one of these former officers saying that viral video, right, that we saw so much during the trial of Derek Chauvin was, quote, not, I don't want to quote here, but was basically not what his client saw or experienced that day. What is the defense strategy? Who are they pointing the finger at here? Are they trying to make Derek Chauvin out to be kind of the ringleader, somebody who obviously has already been convicted in Floyd's murder?
Yeah, you totally hit the nail on the head. That's exactly what they're trying to do here, shifting the blame to Derek Chauvin, saying he is responsible for George Floyd's death. He's been convicted of it. It was his knee that was on George Floyd's neck for more than 9 minutes. So that's one of the things that they're trying to prove. But they're also trying to say and frame this as Derek Chauvin was the most senior police officer out there, and that the rest of these other officers were just following his lead, Hallie.
The judge in this trial repeatedly said to jurors that Derek Chauvin's conviction, the one that we just talked about on the state charges, should not be an influence in these proceedings here, right? Is it at all possible that Chauvin could end up maybe testifying in this, since he was somebody who was on the scene and there that day?
Yeah, you know, it's a really great question. And we asked legal experts. They say it is absolutely possible that we could see Derek Chauvin take the witness stand. But at this point, we've not gotten any indication one way or another if he actually will be inside that courtroom to testify for the prosecution, Hallie.
Does it feel like this is moving faster than expected? You know, jury selection wrapped up in just one day instead of 2. Yeah. Like, what about the pace here?
Right. Yeah. So, again, talking to legal experts to give some perspective who see this all the time. And they said, no, this is incredibly fast, given the fact that this is such a high profile case. Usually it takes longer than a day to pick a jury. And then when you look at what happened in Derek Chauvin's trial, it took 2 weeks to pick a jury. But this is something that the judge says he wants to see. He wants this process to move as expeditiously as possible because his biggest concern here is COVID. He doesn't want to see an outbreak inside the courtroom. So he's calling for jury selection one day. We saw that. He believes that this trial could also wrap up in about 4 weeks, Hallie.
Megan Fitzgerald, I know you're going to be watching all of it for us, keeping us updated on the latest from that trial. Megan, thank you so much. To New York now, where the mayor there, Eric Adams, announced his plan to try to bring gun violence in the city down by announcing a blueprint for safety today after a shooting Friday night that left one officer dead and another still in the hospital fighting for his life. Adams says the NYPD will immediately put more officers on the streets and in the subway. Other parts of the plan focus on mental health and trying to get rid of illegal guns. Of course, he has some critics who say they're worried about the return of plainclothes officers. That was something stopped in 2020 because of concerns about excessive force and targeting people by race. Coming up here on the show, some state attorneys general suing Google. Why? For tracking users without their permission. Jake Ward has more details on that and what it means for your privacy coming up after the break. So did you hear about this new lawsuit today filed by 3 different states attorneys general along with D.C.? It basically says, hey, Google, this is the accusation, that Google, you don't stop tracking my location even when I ask you and I turn it off from my location history. Their argument is that even if you turn off your location, Google can still access it through other services, through Wi-Fi, through Bluetooth, for example. These AGs say Google's been misleading people about protecting their privacy for years. What does Google say? Well, they're denying it. They say this is based on, quote, inaccurate claims and outdated assertions. Jake Ward is joining us now with more. Jake, this suit also says Google used these dark patterns, like telling users certain apps wouldn't work properly if they didn't turn on their location sharing, right? How does this work? And is this suit, like I put this to you because you're brilliant and I know you can answer it, but like, is this suit based on outdated assumptions or not?
Well, let's see. Hallie, first of all, thank you so much. What a kind thing to say. You know, dark patterns as a term of art has become this bucket category for, places in which you and I, in signing up for a thing or using a thing online, are confused by the process. And critics say confused on purpose to keep us from actually removing data that a company can make money off of. Now, in this case, these 4 attorneys general are essentially arguing that even though Google tells you in pretty straightforward language throughout their services that if you turn location services off or you clear your location history, that Google will no longer store your location data. They say that's not true. If you continue to use other Google products, its Maps or other services, then those services can continue to track you. So what we're looking at here, they say, is a world in which there's so many different products made by Google, they have not made it as clear as their language claims that you have turned off your location data when they say that you have.
Is some of this, lawsuit aside, a little bit about sending a message to whether the suit succeeds or not just to Google, but to other tech companies like, hey, we're watching you and we're paying attention?
Well, I think that's right. We were seeing, individual states go after these big companies like Google. Google is, in fact, the subject of a very similar lawsuit in Arizona. And, the discovery phase there has amounted to about 200,000 documents. You can assume that that is all going to be shared information among attorneys general. So we're seeing definitely a body of knowledge being assembled by regulators. And we are seeing some effects. I mean, Fenwick and West, which is a big, prestigious law firm that has represented Google and Apple and Twitter and Uber and others, they, in fact, sent out a warning to their client base saying you should probably look back at how you communicate this kind of stuff so that you do not get in trouble in the future. We are starting to see, the term dark patterns used by regulators, and we're starting to see it trickle into the consciousness of these companies as they think about the future, Hallie.
Just want to emphasize, Google denies any wrongdoing here, right? We got to say that piece of it. When it comes to the news you can use, Jake, is there anything that people who use Google, right, use different apps, use location, what should we be aware of, right? What advice would you give to folks who are saying, maybe I don't want some big company to know where I am all the time, and I want to be sure of that?
It is interesting, right? Because I think that the rhetoric of tech companies has always been, we are making these apps as straightforward as we can, and it is on, we've come this far, and you consumers need to take responsibility for your own privacy. We've made it easier for you. What these AGs are, of course, saying is it's not as easy as you think. So when you ask, how do you do it? Well, you really have to go into your settings, according to these AGs, and turn off not just location services on the phone. You have to go into the individual Google products and make sure that they are not tracking you as well. So it turns out it's not as simple as a single swipe of your finger. It may, in fact, require an hour or so of investigation to get into the settings. That's what the AGs are alleging here.
Jake Ward, live for us, breaking down that lawsuit, and more to watch on that for sure. Thank you, friend. Appreciate it. Still to come, a really tough month-long lockdown lifted from a Chinese city because of COVID just less than 2 weeks ahead of the Winter Olympics. We'll talk more about what else China's doing ahead of the games coming up in the 5 things. Plus, the Supreme Court, we now know, will consider a challenge to affirmative action, challenges plural, in college admissions. Pete Williams breaks it down for us coming up. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, a man from Australia has pleaded guilty to abducting a 4-year-old girl from her family's camping tent last October. Cleo Smith was found 18 days later alone in a house in a search you might remember made headlines all around the world. Officials say they still don't know why this guy decided to grab that little girl. Number 2, a month-long lockdown lifted off the city of Xi'an, China. 13 million people had been forced to isolate in what was one of the country's harshest COVID lockdowns. You've got 2 million people in Beijing, meantime, being tested ahead of the Winter Olympics. Number 3, Sarah Palin has tested positive for COVID. Why does that matter? Well, she's delaying her defamation trial against the New York Times because of it. The judge in the case made the announcement today and mentioned the former Republican nominee for vice president is not vaccinated. The court is waiting for a second test before deciding if the trial should be adjourned to a later date. Number 4, a luxury cruise ship that was supposed to dock in Miami took a detour to the Bahamas after a U.S. judge granted an order to seize the vessel. The lawsuit is over fuel they didn't pay for, something like $4 million worth. Hundreds of people were on board. Many of them said they didn't know what was going on. Number 5, Krispy Kreme is giving away free donuts to help fight a nationwide blood shortage this week. Krispy Kreme says it'll give away a dozen glazed donuts to people who donate blood to the American Red Cross. All you have to do, show up to a Krispy Krispy Kreme. Is that hard to say for everybody or just me? I don't know. Show up to a Krispy Kreme shot, show proof for your donation, and you get a dozen donuts for free. How about that? So, affirmative action is facing, it seems, its most serious threat in years. Why? Because the Supreme Court is again going to take a look at whether universities may consider race when it comes to kids trying to get into college. The court said it would examine admissions policies at Harvard and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. In these latest cases, opponents of affirmative action sued those universities, one private and one public, right? They claim their undergraduate admissions system discriminated against Asian American students in the Harvard case, and both Asian American and white students in the case of North Carolina. Lower courts found that both complied with previous Supreme Court decisions that said race could be used as one factor when considering college applicants. Pete Williams joins us now with this story. Pete, this is interesting for a few reasons, right? So number one, just lay out the stakes here, right? Because this is a potentially huge deal that could affect both public and private schools.
Yes, public schools because of the Supreme Court's rule on what the government can do, private schools because they get money from the federal government. So what the Supreme Court says here about affirmative action is going to affect all kinds of universities, except those in states like California and Michigan that have already outlawed affirmative action. So the question is whether schools can use it as one factor, which is what they do, as a plus factor in considering a student's overall background. What the opponents say is, if a school wants to achieve diversity, then it should look to the actual experiences and qualifications and life story of the students and not use race as a proxy. So that's what the Supreme Court will look at, whether the schools can continue to use race to achieve diversity, which the Supreme Court in the past has said is an educational benefit. So the only question here, I think, Hallie, is whether the Supreme Court's going to ban it outright or simply narrow it greatly.
But explain this to people who might be thinking back, a few years and go, wait a second, I thought the Supreme Court had upheld this before, right? It's a different court now.
Yeah, that makes all the difference. So there was a 2003 decision that's really kind of the turning point here in the modern time. The Supreme Court in the past has said you can't have racial quotas. And then the Supreme Court in 2003 sort of pointed it in a new direction on this idea of educational diversity and said if a school clearly doesn't have quotas and has a clear policy about using it as a plus factor, then it's okay, and it sort of reaffirmed that decision 6 years ago. The difference now is that two of the justices who voted for affirmative action in the past are gone. Anthony Kennedy, who retired, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who died, replaced by two Trump appointees, Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett. Now, we don't know what their views on affirmative action are because they've never written judicial decisions during their time on the lower courts, but I think it's fair to say they'll probably be more skeptical than either Kennedy or Ginsburg.
Timeline, Pete, when the court might take this up?
The court will take it up in the new term, so I would think the argument in maybe October or November.
Okay. Anything else we should know about this?
Well, it's a different court, and the question is, will the Supreme Court simply bring it completely to an end, or more narrowly say, all right, you can use it in just these very narrow characteristics? And both sides agree that if the Supreme Court does eliminate affirmative action, it would probably reduce a minority enrollment in most of the colleges and universities that are competitive.
I promise I'll let you go after this, and I know you don't know because we haven't even heard the oral arguments yet, right, which is where a lot of your tea leaf reading comes from. Do we know for these two newer justices on the court, you mentioned them, Amy Coney Barrett, Brett Kavanaugh, where do they stand on affirmative action? Do we know based on things that they've said and written before?
Well, because they've never written lower court opinions on affirmative action or have clear votes on the affirmative action question, we don't know for sure. But they are conservatives, and generally speaking, conservatives on this court have taken a narrower view of affirmative action. Chief Justice John Roberts, for example, has said that the government simply can't consider race when it makes a decision on anything, including school admissions.
Pete Williams, live for us there in the newsroom. Pete, thank you, as always. Still ahead on the show, ex-Pope Benedict now admitting he was at a meeting about an accused predatory priest, coming after reports that he turned a blind eye to sexual abuse in Germany. We've got Ann Thompson with more in tonight's backstory. Plus, a Connecticut man charged after a tirade at a smoothie shop. Have you seen this? We'll talk about what led up to it in the local. With papal news in the headlines this afternoon, we're about to get to Ann Thompson for a closer look at what it's like to cover the Vatican, coming up in the backstory. But first, NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day, and because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. From our Northeast Bureau, a Connecticut man has been charged after throwing a drink and making a racist, anti-immigrant comment at a smoothie shop. Police say this man went on a tirade after blaming employees for a serious allergic reaction that sent his son to the hospital. He's been charged with intimidation based on bigotry or bias and criminal trespassing. A statement from an attorney says he regrets the incident wholeheartedly and that his actions occurred during a moment of extreme emotional distress. From our Southeast Bureau, dramatic video shows a Florida man fighting a black bear off his porch to try to protect his family and his dogs. Are you looking at that? So he shoves the animal out and then puts a bench in the way to block it. Ooh. He was hurt, but he's doing okay, luckily. The bear has not been found yet. And from our Midwest Bureau, a little bit of a reminder to check your spam folder. That's because Michigan woman Laura Spears was sifting through her junk mail when she discovered she won $3 million in a lottery prize. She got her Mega Millions back on New Year's Eve, didn't know about it till she checked the junk folder. Do it. Spears says she plans to spend her winnings with her family and retire early. You go. I want to go now to a story that we like to call the backstory, a behind-the-scenes look at the bigger picture and how a story comes together. And tonight, it's coming to us from the Vatican. That is where, in fact, retired Pope Benedict XVI is backtracking on a statement from last week when he was accused in a report of mishandling 4 cases in which priests were accused of sexual abuse in Munich. This was when he was Archbishop of Munich. Benedict denied any wrongdoing and said he wasn't at a 1980 meeting to talk about one of those cases. Today, Benedict's personal secretary apologized, said he was indeed there, and that his previous response was a misstatement because of an editing error. The secretary also says the former pope will address the 2,000-page report after reading it. You've also got, at the same time, this initiative to try to make the church more inclusive, now making its way through Germany. More than 120 employees of the Catholic Church there have publicly outed themselves as queer. They say they want to live openly without fear and are demanding the church allow the blessing of same-sex couples, among other requests. A lot of news out of the Vatican tonight, and somebody who's covered so much of it is Ann Thompson, who has spent years covering the Pope. She joins me now with more on this. Ann, there's so much to get into here, and let me start with what we sort of started with. When it comes to these kinds of stories about abuse and controversy, the Vatican is extremely careful about the information and the kinds of statements that it puts out. Can you pull back the curtain a little bit? Because I don't think you've ever done a backstory for a little bit more on like what it's like behind the scenes. How do you go about trying to get information from officials in these instances? Is it different than how you might normally do it?
No, not really, Hallie. It's the same thing. And the Vatican has a press office the same way the White House has a press office. You go to those people, you try to find out, you call your sources who are not part of the press office to see what else is going on. But I think what's really extraordinary here about both the statement that was made today in Pope Emeritus Benedict's name and then the statement that the Vatican put out last week when the German report first came out is that in both cases they talk about the victims. They mention that they apologize for the pain and suffering of the victims, and they say that the Vatican feels close to the victims. I can tell you that in 20 years of covering the Catholic Church, that is a sea change, because when these accusations first started back in, or really we paid attention to them in this country, back in 2001, the Vatican was extraordinarily defensive. They would offer no kind of compassion or embrace of the victims. It was very standoffish. That has changed dramatically, and that's due to a couple of things. One, the fact that both Pope Benedict and Pope Francis have met with abuse survivors, and also you can see in those statements the influence of Boston Cardinal Sean O'Malley, who had to clean up the Archdiocese of Boston, and he has been tasked by Pope Francis to help deal with this issue of abuse around the world.
You've traveled with the Pope before, and I mean, you've been on, his trips to other countries, the plane, you've been to the Vatican. When you are in those moments, and we're showing some of the video for it now, I don't know if you can see it, but it's you chatting with the Pope. How much time do you really get to talk with him or spend with him on these kinds of trips? What is that like?
You don't get a lot of time. You do get to meet him when you're on the papal plane. He will come back on the first leg of the trip, and he will come and greet all the journalists. And it's quite nice, and you get about 30 seconds to maybe a minute to talk to him, and you can also listen into his other conversations. But what Pope Francis does, which is truly extraordinary, is at the end of every trip, he comes to the back of the plane. That's where the journalist sits, and he gives a press conference. I was there when he gave his first papal press conference on his trip home from Rio, and he stood there for 81 minutes.
Wow.
Never looked at a note, never asked an aide for anything, and just answered our questions. And it was at that press conference where, when he was asked about if a priest came to you and said he was gay, what would you do? And Pope Francis said, "Who am I to judge?" It really is extraordinary to see someone in that position of power be willing to have that kind of give and take with journalists. I mean, you just eat it up.
And I mean, you're right there front row, as we saw in some of the footage that we're showing. When I've traveled, when I used to cover the President of the United States, you travel in a bubble. There's a ton of security, right? I imagine it's the same for the Pope.
Mm-hmm. It is, and one of the strange things that they do, Hallie, is that when you get on the papal plane on the first leg, they actually take your passport, and they don't give it back to you until you land back in Rome and the trip is all over. And I can remember the first time they did it, I didn't want to give up my passport. I mean, I've traveled the world, and I'm so used to having my passport with me. And they're like, "No, this is kind of the price of admission. This is what you have to do." What I will say about papal security, especially with Francis, is it's much more low-key than, for example, presidential security. There is no beast. Pope Francis likes little cars. He doesn't want to be in a big, giant motorcade, even though sometimes he has to be, because just for security reasons. But it is, it's a pretty extraordinary experience.
I'm so glad that you're able to share some of that with us. And I'm telling you, I'm loving looking at the archival footage, too. Ann Thompson, it's great to have you on the Backstory. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Coming up here on the show this week, maybe make or break for the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. You know the deal if you've been watching the show or covering it. Parties, apparently, when the rest of the country was under strict COVID rules. We've got Keir Simmons in London for us with the latest. Any day now, a report could drop that could kickstart the end of Prime Minister Boris Johnson's leadership over in the UK. It's coming as there's some news that he reportedly attended a surprise birthday party thrown by his wife back in June of 2020, right at the height of the lockdowns, remember, in COVID. A Downing Street spokesperson denies there was a party, just a gathering in the cabinet room to wish him a happy birthday, and that Johnson was only there for less than 10 minutes. It's parties like that one that the report's looking into. And let's not forget the recent allegations against him of religious discrimination, as well as members of Johnson's own Conservative Party saying they're now being blackmailed for openly criticizing him. Keir Simmons is in London for all of this. Keir, we keep talking about Boris Johnson. We've covered when this news comes out of these parties and these issues, et cetera. Now we've got this report that could drop at any point, right? How much trouble is Boris Johnson really in?
Oh, he's in trouble. For a prime minister who seems to kind of enjoy getting himself in trouble, he's in real trouble right now. 54 members of the British Conservative parliamentary members, if they all together, and ask for a vote of no confidence in him, then that vote of no confidence has to happen. And, Hallie, for people who know their politics, there are few political parties in the world as ruthless as the British Conservative Party, few parties as barbarous, as brutal, as callous, as cutthroat, as ferocious, as fierce. You get the picture.
I do.
There are plots within plots. There are schemes. And after all that, Boris Johnson may survive. Look, he is the great survivor. Interesting aspect of this, Hallie, the British Prime Minister can be removed by his political party, a bit like the Speaker of the House. He is there because his party put him there. That's how Margaret Thatcher was removed from office. And if it can happen to Margaret Thatcher, it can happen to any Prime Minister.
Keir, this vote of no confidence that you're talking about, presumably if that happens, it would be after we get word, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like it would logically happen after word of this investigation that's happening, right? This investigation is by Sue Gray, this internal investigation. It's not independent. Can you talk me through what the expectation is for that? Because, you know, the Prime Minister himself ordered that. Are there questions about that? You know what I mean?
Yeah, listen, Sue Gray, who is leading this investigation, is thought to be pretty tough, frankly. The vote against the Prime Minister can happen at any time, whenever his party decides. But this report is crucial. There were, as I think you mentioned earlier, there were 16 examples of parties during COVID, including during the lockdowns. There are allegations that there were parties when people weren't supposed to gather inside. As you say, allegations that there was a party for his birthday, allegations of a Christmas party, allegations of 3 parties in 1 month, including 2 on one night. So there are a lot of parties. You know, Hallie, listen, Boris Johnson admires Winston Churchill, who himself enjoyed a drink or two with friends and colleagues into the night. The difference, of course, is during the Second World War, it wasn't against the law to gather inside and drink together during a COVID lockdown. And here's another twist, which is just kind of amazing. Sue Gray, who is leading that investigation, has interviewed the police, apparently, at Downing Street and got their evidence about whether a party was taking place, which, of course, was against the law. And, of course, around the UK, there were parties that were being raided by the police because it was against the law. So it raises the question, why didn't the police stop it? It's more than just the Prime Minister who's in hot water over this, honestly.
Keir Simmons, I know you'll stay on top of this one. Please come back. Give us updates. We definitely want to know how this one turns out. Keir Simmons live for us in London. Thank you. We want to get back to the White House because we told you at the top of the show how President Biden had been on that call with European allies, right? With this Russia-Ukraine tension really starting to spill over. We're now, literally as we've been on the air, we're getting an update on how that meeting went from President Biden himself. So Mike Memoli has sprinted back to his post at the North Lawn of the White House. He is joining us now live, I believe, if he pops up. There he is, Mike. So the president was shouted some questions here. He said something interesting. He said that there was total unanimity with these allies, right?
Yeah, Hallie, think about how you started your show today. It was about the sort of volatility on Wall Street, the concerns about the economy. The president actually, in a strange late in the afternoon event, was talking about just that, the economy, some of the efforts in the administration to talk about inflation. And then we reporters do what we always do, which is start shouting a lot of questions as soon as we get the chance. We wanted a readout of what happened on this call. Let's listen to how the president responded and pay close attention to how he starts his answer.
This is really important. I had a very, very, very good meeting, total unanimity with all the European leaders. We'll talk about it later. Thank you.
So he wants to talk about it later. That's one of the big questions, Hallie, is when will the country hear in a more fulsome way from President Biden about his view of the situation in Ukraine? He's only really talked about Ukraine in these sort of short Q&A moments, and that's actually got him into trouble. But before even that clip started, the president actually got a little, rebuffing of the questions because he says he wanted to talk about what was actually the focus of the event he was there to talk about, which is the economy. And with that, I'll send it back to you because there was an interesting moment that followed.
Well, yeah, you know it's coming. Our viewers don't. So, Mike, this is important. This is why you set this up, right? The president really didn't want to answer off-topic questions. But there was this moment, right, towards the end. And listen, I've been in these rooms. You've been in these rooms. You yell questions when you see somebody in a position of power. You want to know information that is relevant to people, that is, your audience, Americans, et cetera. Somebody, I don't know who it was, I think I know who it was, Mike, but I'm going to let you tell me who it was, asked a question that President Biden did not like, right?
Well, a good bit of sparring on the part of the press corps because the president started by saying he didn't want to answer a question about Ukraine because the event was supposed to focus on the economy. So then our friend Peter Doocy of Fox News asked him a question about the economy. It led to this little bit of great color. Let's listen.
Do you think inflation is a political liability?
That's a great asset. More inflation. What a stupid son of a bitch.
Now, Hallie, Peter Doocy, works for Fox News. He's been covering President Biden since the very first day of the campaign. And as you can understand, Peter works for an outlet that covers him very aggressively in some ways that the president thinks is not always fair. So what I will tell you about their relationship is that the president sort of appreciates that that's what he has to do, but it doesn't mean he doesn't get under his skin from time to time. And so he really let his feelings known there, perhaps not realizing the mics were still on. This is a president who's gotten in trouble for hot mics before.
It's tough to call this a hot mic moment. The cameras are there. I don't know, right? Cameras are there. There's a microphone, like, you know, there.
Let's just say that there are some people who think this is a BFD, and at least we could show everything the president said without bleeping any words out.
Streaming, man, that's the benefit. Some people don't think it's a BFD, right? So, you know, take your pick. Mike Memoli, thank you. I really appreciate that. Obviously, with the news coming out of the White House on the president insisting that European allies are arm in arm when it comes to a Russian potential incursion of Ukraine. Mem, thank you. Opening and closing the show for us today, because that's a wrap for this hour. We're going to have more for you here tomorrow. Same time, same place. Coverage picks up right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.